welcome to the Mayor Baba program. I'm Fred Stankus with the Mayor Baba Center here in Southern California, and we have a special guest with us today, Don Stevens, visiting from the south of France. And today's topic is talking about God Speaks. To give you a little background on Don Stevens, Don was born in Nevada and raised in California, and Don attended Johns Hopkins University, from which he graduated with a degree in chemistry. He became employed in the petroleum industry, subsequently traveling throughout the world as a representative of a major American oil company. And during his travels, he met with Meher Baba in India, and thereafter maintained a close relationship, working with Meher Baba on various literary projects and with groups of young people associated with Meher Baba. And today we will be discussing the tremendous work by Meher Baba, God Speaks. Don had the privilege of working with Meher Baba in editing part of the book. Don, welcome. And
Thank you.
Don, in the God Speaks, there is a supplement, and one of the subjects in the supplement is on forgetfulness. That has just fascinated me so much recently. Can you talk a little bit about that particular supplemental subject?
Yes, I certainly will, Fred, because the word forgetful is usually used in a very negative sense. And so if you say to somebody, you're getting forgetful, it means that you're accusing him of starting to run down, and getting into the part of life where life is going to finish off before too much time happens. So to see it used in this context in a positive sense is, first of all, quite a surprise in itself. I think it's wise at this point to recall that it is used in the supplement in the sense, very specifically, of conscious forgetfulness. In other words, when you forget something, you don't go unconscious and the whole subject just drifts off and may be lost for a long time or forever, but you do a deliberate act. You block it out from your conscious mind, and you do it for a very, very specific purpose. In fact, it's a technique that the individual gradually has to learn. Meher Baba was always very careful to point out that if you tried to suppress material from the conscious mind back into the unconscious and simply, let's say, neglect it and say, thank goodness I got rid of that, that you were doing a rather dangerous thing. Because eventually, if it's rather explosive material, and if it keeps getting fed from daily life events, it's likely to build up a pressure and then explode uncontrollably. So we have that context in the background. But here, the word forgetful is being used in the sense that we all have a tendency to stock something just a little bit below the conscious level, try to keep it under control, get rid of it for a period of time, things especially that we can't deal with or that are distasteful to us. But eventually, the individual has got to go back and bring it out. But we all have a tendency to bring it out in a repetitive fashion, often uncontrollably. In other words, we remember when there's nothing we can do about it, and also when it has this facility very often to upset us. So an awful lot of people's remembrance, non-forgetfulness, ends up in a very negative and energy-consuming process. So here, as it's used and elaborated on in the supplement, it is in the sense of a deliberate technique that a spiritual student cultivates over a period of time. Baba even says sometimes it takes lifetimes before one is able to develop the technique and utilize it effectively. It is simply related to the proper use of psychic energy, because one of the greatest things that uses up psychic energy is remembering, worrying, stewing, getting upset, tossing it back into the unconscious again when we have to go about other things. And this process can go on indefinitely. I have to tell you an amusing story, and I think my mother would allow me to tell this and be amused along with it. but I can remember when I was a little tiny boy, my grandmother had been visiting us, and my mother came out of the kitchen absolutely livid, and I thought, my gosh, what under the sun happened? Did my mother and my grandmother have some bad words between each other? And she wouldn't say anything at that point, but when my grandmother had finished off the trip, my mother said, you know, the most terrible thing happened between us. I was cooking the chicken stew, this chicken fricassee, and I always put these little allspice lumps, they're little round brown ones, into it. And they were in the stew, of course, in the rather white gravy. And so grandmother looks over and says, Clara, you've let flies get into the chicken fricassee. Of course, this was a major insult to the young housewife, and she was very upset about it. But can you imagine, every once in a while, until her dying day, all of a sudden, this memory would come up in my mother's mind, and she would really almost blow her top. It continued to carry that amount of emotional energy. So pretty obviously, there are a lot of things that are stored in our memory bank, as it were, which have this negative association and that infuriating association connected with it, and we waste just an awful lot of time remembering them, and usually there's nothing we can do about them because it's in the past, and when we blow up, of course, it's a tremendous amount of one's emotional energy which goes out of the window in no good production. So Baba says that one of the things that the individual absolutely must do in order to make progress on the spiritual path is to master the technique of conscious forgetfulness. He says it's not like when you've got a stamped letter in your pocket and you walk by the post office and forget to mail it. It's not that sort of absence. But it is a deliberate saying, no, 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 to it. Don't pop up your head.
Well, it's in the supplement, I recall, it was pointing out that people seek forgetfulness in order to be happy. In other words, they've had a trying day, so they go in for that cocktail or some kind of stimulant to maybe either slow their mind down or speed it up so they don't have to deal with their remembrance, or sleep. A lot of people who are not in a very happy mood will sleep a lot because they don't have to face, I guess, the remembrance of whatever is going on in their world.
I think maybe I'm abnormal because when I'm upset, I can't sleep.
Well, possibly that also could be one too.
But fortunately, there are fewer things nowadays that upset me, so I sleep better.
That's wonderful. And another part of the book in the supplement is the theme of creation. Of course, that's a subject that could probably take up at least probably 20 or 30 broadcasts to totally cover it. But the theme of creation, can you just give a little bit of a capsule-like explanation of Meher Baba's theme of creation?
Yes. Just to go back for a moment to recapitulate the subject as it was partially covered in an earlier interview, creation is the product of the whim of originally unconscious God to know his divinity consciously. And so, according to Meher Baba, that whim, and a whim, you know, is capricious. There's no logic in back of it. Baba warns in God Speaks and others of his writings that to try to understand exactly what the whim is and why it surges, he said, there's absolutely no way that you will get any progress in trying to understand it. He said, you just have to wait to the day when you yourself become God realized, and then you will know. So he says, let's not do too much fussing around about the precise nature of the whim, how it originated, and why it surged. But he said, capriciously, for no reason, it surges. And the surging of that whim is a disturbance. So out of the disturbance, of course, we all know that most of the phenomena and most of what we call the realities, the presences within creation, in the long run turn out to be conglomerations, solidifications of various types of wave phenomena. I mean, just to be a bit erudite for the moment, but we don't need to dwell on it. Of course, it was Albert Einstein who gave us the very simple formula which ties energy to matter, the relationship. And of course, this is fundamentally the principle on which the atom bomb and the hydrogen bomb are built, the conversion of matter into energy. So certainly one can see immediately that if the whim surges, then this has to be thought of. There's no other way to conceive it than as a wave disturbance. And that is the beginning of the fundamental building blocks in creation. Energy becomes matter. But also, and here I think it is of great help to lean over on Carl Jung, and I think one of the beautiful similes that he gave out in one of his books when he was discussing the subject of consciousness. He made an analogy. He says it's like two batteries of opposite poles. That's what it's, a battery with two opposite poles connected by a filament of metal. And what flows between those two opposite poles through the filament is consciousness. But in creation, the batteries are separateness, contrast, and opposition. And if you say, well, I'm not sure that means too much to me, I would just say, well, let's take an easy example. When you go into a dark room and turn on the light, you are conscious of light and you are conscious of the absence of light. But what would happen if you were never in darkness? I'm not sure that you would be conscious that there was such a thing as light in creation. Whenever you start to begin to think through the things of which you are conscious, you find that in all cases there are contrasts or even oppositions that you are comparing. So Meher Baba starts out with the theme of creation as starting with the surging of this whim. And it's sort of like one of his beautiful analogies, a little boy who's passing a big, beautiful, calm, even lake, and the little boy looks down and he sees a nice rock. Maybe it's a flat one, you know, a skimmer, or maybe it's a nice round one that just goes kerplunk when it goes in. But at any rate, when it falls into the water, and we both know that what happens is there is a wave that surges out. There is a disturbance. And in that wave, there is both, let's say, energy. All right, that's the first building block in creation. But there is also in that same wave the most simple, primordial, original form of contrast that we can conceive. There's the top of the wave and there's the bottom of the wave. And also, there's even a contrast in form, because the front of the wave is like that, and the back of the wave is like that. So there's contrast fundamentally involved there. So we get immediately to Carl Jung's principle. We have contrast, so therefore we have the first simple element capable of generating consciousness. And then suppose, let's say, the boy tosses in another stone. You know, very often one is so enchanted with these things that one continues on. That's the nature of the whim. It's just like the little boy continuing to throw in more and more stones into the pond, which is no longer quiet. What happens? Well, you've seen it happen. The waves get more complicated, they intersect, and first thing you know, you have a tremendous spectrum of waves. And that, again, is what we have in creation, an enormous long spectrum of waves. So it doesn't take too much imagination or scientific background to see that out of that first surging of the whim, the complexity of creation as we know it can gradually be built. And it's pretty obvious as one reads through God Speaks, it's something called the drop soul, calls it also the Atma, which is a finite imagined separation of Paramatma, in other words, of God, which thinks of itself as being separate and to this, separated in imagination, little tiny portion of God, these first primordial elements of consciousness and habit and a form accumulate. Baba puts it in, he uses the word associate. They associate themselves with this drop soul that is forming. And the drop soul goes on, and there are more and more things that it bumps into, so the experience becomes more complex. The form becomes more complex because the form is directly tied to the complexity of the experience. That's a bit of a long subject, and I'm certainly not going to try to jump into the middle of it. But this is where evolution of form and evolution of consciousness, which, after all, Baba points out is the end purpose of creation, keep complexifying. I don't know if there's an English word, complexify, but you understand what I'm driving up at, and you understand what I mean. So this is the beginning, in a very simple, natural manner, of the evolution of form and the evolution of consciousness. And it goes on, and it goes up through the metal, stone, metal, vegetable, and on up into the higher species, and eventually arises to the human form. At that point, Baba says something that's pretty earth-shaking. He simply says that at that point, consciousness is complete. And why is it complete? Because at that point, it has reached a level of complexity, of sophistication, to be able, under proper circumstances, to reflect on the true nature of reality and pierce through and find that its own reality is Godhood, which we call illumination or God realization or whatever not. So, but it takes a long time after consciousness first reaches that level of complexity before the drop soul can get rid of all of the pushes and pulls that have been generated in the process of coming to consciousness. And this Baba calls involution. And if you look at the chart of creation, which his wonderful artist Ronald Gailey did for him, you see that the knots that were forming like that in the next part go like that, and they unwind. So it's a long, long process with a lot of adventures. Probably the most, critical adventure is in what is called the fourth plane. And that's where occult forces, for the first time, become fully available to the individual drop soul or human being at that stage. And there a lot of trouble can result.
In the reincarnation state, a soul goes through many lives and births and deaths. Isn't it something like 8,400,000 before it enters the involutionary state? So, but the soul is always one. It doesn't change. The reincarnation aspect is just similar to like a dream, I guess.
Well, can I be? Baba is very precise on that. He says the physical body is just like any other physical thing, like your automobile. It starts developing problems, and first thing you know, it can't run anymore. So you abandon it, it goes to the scrap heap. So your physical body is just like the car or the overcoat or whatever not that you may have, and eventually it's going to run out of running power. It just can no longer function as a coherent unity. But Baba points out that a human being is actually a complex of four components. There is the drop soul part, which is really God, and of course we don't have too much conscious contact with that early on in the game. And then associated with that are three bodies: a mental body in which are stored these habit patterns or impressions that have gradually developed all up through this long process of evolution, and then even involution. They still keep on developing. They're stored in the mental body. Then next to that there is the subtle body, which is more, let's say, the powerhouse, the energy part of our nature. And then there's finally the physical body. And Baba just says very simply, and he's not the first one who has said this, But he points it out very strongly that when the physical body wears out, it's discarded and left. But the drop soul, the Atma, is still associated with the mental body and the subtle body. And what happens is that the storage content of the mental body for the last lifetime is brought up for review. He says it's something like the film. Again, an analogy that has been mentioned before. Bob is not soul and unique, but it's an interesting process. So if most of the storage content of a previous lifetime is pretty negative, we go through hell. So that's where hell is. But it's an emotional state. It's not a place up there somewhere or another with somebody with a pitchfork and so on, keeps count of who's coming in. But on the other hand, if there was just an awful lot of really wonderful enlightened experiences, and you did a lot of good jobs through it, then when you review this, well, it's delectable. Somewhere or another, when you don't have the physical body, you experience things much more intensely. So that's why you can go through hell when you re-experience things, and that's why you can be in heaven when you experience other sorts of things. So this goes on at the end of each dropping of the particular physical body that's been worn out. He says an awfully interesting thing, and I really like this one. He said, when you relive these experiences, you digest them and you essentialize them, and as you essentialize them, you arrive at a permanent body of knowledge, which then becomes stored as well and becomes a part of your intuitive wisdom in succeeding lifetimes. So if you do a good job of it, you've got quite a storage bin there with a lot of things that really help. So this process goes on, and gradually these habit patterns, or samskaras as he calls them, are de-energized. He says another important thing. He says they are not totally wiped out. These ancient habit experiences continue on, and we de-energize them, but there is, as it were, almost like a nugget of gold in each one. And this seems to be associated with what Baba uses 4 or 5 times in God Speaks beautifully. He talks about the infinite, individualized consciousness of God. And note that word individualized, because I think that is absolutely key. So apparently, the nugget that is retained in each one of these impressions or samskaras is the quality of individualization. And this seems to be a vital component of the contribution of each drop soul to God. In fact, I would like to speculate that I don't think there is anything of you or me that we have ever experienced in this lifetime or in previous lifetimes in which the individuality of the situation is lost, is permanent and eternal. I like to think of it that way.
It's wonderful. I see we're getting about 3-4 minutes remaining in the program, and I wanted to ask you about that group of interconnection or interlinks you've established over in, I guess, in Europe, where groups of 4 or 5 people meet on a regular basis. Can you just give us some information about how that works?
Well, I think that's awfully important. We simply became, first of all, aware of the fact that to do intensive work and really get somewhere with it and have the chance to reflect and share, that we couldn't be on daggers point terms with one another. In other words, the usual human qualities of getting mad and upset with the other guy and criticizing him and, feeling an opposition couldn't work. So we found that if we made a deep effort, really, to develop a deep interrelationship with other people in the group, it was necessary to limit somewhat the absolute numbers. We found we could get up to 8, 10, maybe 12, but that seemed to be about a maximum. And then we ran across one final thing, Mayor Baba's last declaration on the alphabet board, when he talks about inner links. And this is what I think is terribly important, doing any sort of group work in the spiritual life, that one have true inner links, true companionship with the other individual. I think it's a necessary base.
Wonderful. So you've been meeting in Spain and France with...
In England, yes. Several groups feel that to be an extremely important component. Some have even formally closed themselves to outside people. People can knock on the door and get in, but they just can't walk in and say, I'd like to visit you today.
And you work on both spiritual and personal matters.
Well, the personal matters are very frequently so intensely spiritual.
I see.
I think the problems of daily life are, let's say, the spiritual proving ground, the spiritual laboratory in almost all cases for us. Certainly Baba made that clear to me. He said, you're in the oil business because that most closely and directly relates to the sanskaras and the karma that you must work out in this lifetime and stay in it. That really surprised me. But then it worked. I saw it working.
Well, we're happy that you arrived in Los Angeles this fall and visited with us, Don. Thank you so much for being with us here.
Pleasure.
Merwan Shiriyai Irani, known as Meher Baba, was born in Pune, India on February 25, 1894, of Persian parents. His father, Shiriyai Irani, was of Zoroastrian faith and a true seeker of God. Merwan went to a Christian high school in Pune and later attended Deccan College. In 1913, while in college, a momentous event occurred in his life. The meeting with Harzat Babajan, an ancient Mohammedan woman and one of the 5 perfect masters of the age. Babajan gave him God realization and made him aware of his high spiritual destiny. Eventually, he was drawn to seek out another perfect master, Upasni Maharaj, a Hindu who lived in Sikori. During the next 7 years, Maharaj gave Merwan gnosis, or divine knowledge. Thus, Merwan attained spiritual perfection. His spiritual mission began in 1921, when he drew together his first close disciples. It was these early disciples who gave him the name Meher Baba, which means compassionate father. After years of intensive training of his disciples, Meher Baba established a colony near Ahmednagar that is called Mehrabad. Here the master's work embraced a free school where spiritual training was stressed, a free hospital and dispensary, and shelters for the poor. No distinction was made between the high castes and the untouchables. All mingled in common fellowship through the inspiration of the master. To his disciples at Mehrabad, who were of different castes and creeds, he gave a training of moral discipline, love for God, spiritual understanding, and selfless service. Meher Baba told his disciples from July 10, 1925, he would observe silence. From that day until he dropped his body on January 31, 1969, he maintained this silence. His many spiritual discourses and messages have been dictated by means of an alphabet board. Much later, the master discontinued the use of the board and reduced all communication to hand gestures, unique in expressiveness and understandable to many. Meher Baba traveled to the Western world 6 times. First in 1931 when he contacted his early Western disciples. His last visit to America was in 1958 when he and his disciples stayed at the center established for his work at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. In India, as many as 100,000 people came in one day to seek his darshan, or blessing. Many from all over the world journeyed to spend a few days, even a single day, in his presence. An important part of Meher Baba's work through the years was to personally contact and serve hundreds of those known in India as musts. These are advanced pilgrims on the spiritual path who have become spiritually intoxicated from direct awareness of God. For this work, he traveled many thousands of miles to remote places throughout India and Ceylon. Other vital work was washing the feet of